Hello, welcome to our third day of our conference. I'm happy and honored to welcome today my dear friends and colleagues from Greece who have honored me with their presence at our conference this year. They will introduce what I know in psychohistory is absolutely necessary, some concepts and theory on the group analysis and group theories. We have the group process, but we don't know a lot about group process indeed in psychohistory. So we have at our disposal 2 hours. There will be 4 presentations. I suggest you keep it in 20 minutes each of you. We can have after each presentation 10 minutes of discussion. Then we will have a 5 minutes break and we will go to the second hour. Stavros Charalambides will be the first one starting our today panel. So I will be introducing him. So Stavros is a writer, a theatrical producer and playwright, a supervising and training relational psychoanalyst and group psychotherapist. He has been an elected board member of the IARP, International Association of Relational Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy, since 2018, and since February 2024 also serves as an elected board member of the American Group Psychotherapy Association. Together with Gila Offer, he co-chairs the IARP Special Interest Group on Couples, Families, and Groups. He is the founder and director of the Greek Institute for Relational and Group Psychotherapy, established in 2016, where he has also developed and currently oversees 4 specialized training programs in relational psychoanalysis and group psychotherapy. Charalambides works extensively with individuals, couples, siblings, small and large groups, and institutional systems. His main clinical and theoretical interests focus on sibling dynamics, envy, mourning, and hatred in the transference and countertransference across different analytic and group settings, from the diet to the multicultural social field. His first individual book, called The Envy and Executioner, was published in Greek in 2022. His second book, The Enraged Slaves, came out in March 2025. He is also the editor of the first and second collective Greek volumes on relational psychoanalysis and group dynamics, published in July 2023 and September 2024, respectively. He is currently editing the third collective volume, scheduled for publication shortly. Additionally, his third individual book is also forthcoming. So having said that, Stavros, you are the first speaker, so please.
Stavros, you are muted.
Okay, thanks. I would like to thank Gabriela for inviting us to this wonderful panel, and also the International Psychohistory Association for co-creating this marvelous psychohistory symbolization. It's the second year that we are supporting wholeheartedly as an institute this important event. I would like to check with you if you see my presentation online.
Yes, we see it.
Do you want to make it larger, or it's okay?
I think it's okay.
Okay. So I will speak about the institutional unconscious today and how power colonizes the psyche and trauma governs belonging. The psychic architecture of the institution. This presentation examines how trauma becomes embedded within institutional structures and internalized as a psychic organizer that regulates loyalty, obedience, exclusion, and the very possibility of belonging. Institutions are approached not merely as administrative systems or professional communities, but as psychic objects that carry unprocessed historical violence. This violence is transmitted through norms, silences, rituals of obedience, implicit mandates, and forms of loyalty that appear ethical on the surface, while unconsciously reproducing the injuries they claim to heal. The institutional unconscious is not reducible to the social unconscious, although it is always in dialogue with it. The social unconscious carries the unthought histories of a culture, a nation, a class, a gender order, and a political community. The institutional unconscious is the way these histories become organized inside a specific professional body, an institute, an association, a training culture, a board, a faculty, and a large group. It is the institution's psychic climate, the residue of what has not been mourned, the memory of what has not been symbolized, and the mandate of what must not be said. Following Winnicott's insight that there is no such thing as a baby without its relationship to the mother, we might say, there is no institutional unconscious without an institute and its attachment to a larger societal frame. The institutional unconscious must be studied as both autonomous and relational, as static and dynamic at the same time. The Psychoanalytic Institute, perhaps more than any other professional body, is especially vulnerable to this paradox. It is founded on the promise of listening to the unconscious, yet it can become organized around powerful unconscious prohibitions. It teaches interpretation, yet may forbid the interpretation of its own power. It trains analysts to recognize transference, yet may punish those who name institutional transference. It speaks of trauma, dependency, and repair, yet may reproduce obedience, humiliation, exclusion, or idealization in the name of training, tradition, or analytic seriousness. When trauma governs by belonging. The central argument of this paper is that trauma governs belonging when an institution has not metabolized its own history. In such contexts, belonging is no longer based on creative participation, recognition, and symbolic contribution. It becomes regulated through submission to inherited emotional order. One belongs by carrying the right silence, by repeating the right language, by not restepping the founding mythology, by recognizing who may speak and who must remain grateful. Power colonizes the psyche when members begin to experience institutional obedience as inner necessity rather than external demand. The voice of the institution becomes confused with the voice of conscience. This colonization is rarely direct. It does not usually appear as explicit authoritarianism. It appears as atmosphere. It appears in the tone of a supervisor, in the hesitation before speaking in a seminar, in the same attached dissent, in the invisible ranking of bodies and biographies, and in the quiet fear that one's professional future depends on emotional compliance. The institution does not need to say obey. The traumatized institution teaches its members to anticipate what must not be said. It transmits its prohibitions through the register of atmosphere rather than command, making them all the more difficult to recognize, name, or resist. This dynamic is especially salient for the theme of this conference, breaking cycles of violence. Institutions perpetuate violence not only through overt acts of exclusion or punishment, but through the more insidious transmission of emotional compliance. When a trainee learns that belonging requires a particular kind of silence, the institution has not merely shaped behavior, it has colonized psychic space. The cycle of violence is reproduced at the level of identification, not only at the level of action. Let's see where the last group can join as a diagnostic space for the institutional mind. The last group offers a privileged space in which these dynamics may become visible. In the last group, participants do not speak only as individuals. They also speak as carriers of institutional memory, unconscious role assignments, national histories, professional hierarchies, gender positions, generational injuries, and unprocessed collective anxieties. The last group is therefore not simply a clinical or educational method. It is a diagnostic space for the institution itself. It reveals how the institution dreams, how it defends itself, how it distributes shame, how it selects scapegoats, how it protects its myths, and how it may begin to repair. Facilitators of large groups must remain attuned to various enactments that manifest in the course of the group's interactions and serve as indicators of unconscious material requiring further exploration. The temporal dimension of these enactments is particularly silent. The pre-group period encompasses not only the immediate moments preceding the session, but also the broader interval between successive large group meetings and, crucially, the historical and institutional antecedents that shape the group's discourse. In psychoanalytic terms, this is the there and then that invariably finds expression in the here and now. In the last groups of the Institute, participants often entered the room believing they were bringing personal associations. Gradually, however, it became clear that these associations were also institutional messages. A hesitation could belong to a trainee, but also to a history of silenced trainees. A complaint could be personal, but also the return of a forgotten institutional wound. A fantasy about the director could be dipal, fraternal, erotic, hostile, dependent, or political, but it could also be a way for the institution to speak about its own structure of authority. The personal was never merely personal. The institutional was never merely organizational. And let's see how a dream is making the unconscious by interpretation in the here and now conscious. One clinical institutional moment may illuminate this with particular force. During a large group session at the Institute, a candidate analyst, whom I will call Konstantinos, said that he had had a dream the previous night and asked, with some uncertainty, whether it was appropriate to bring it into the group. His question was itself already telling. In asking permission to speak, he was already enacting the very dynamic the dream would go on to describe. His voice was careful, almost apologetic, as if he were asking for authorization, not only from the facilitators, but from the walls of the Institute itself. After a moment of silence, he spoke. I dreamed that I was inside the Institute, but the building was much larger than it in reality. It had endless corridors and many doors. Every door had a name on it, but the names kept changing as I approached them. I saw Daphne standing near a staircase, holding a folder full of all the papers. She told me that the papers were not mine, but that I had to sign them. I asked her what they were. She said, they are the memories of the Institute. Everyone signs them eventually. Then I saw Konstantin sitting at the long table. He was writing the minutes of a meeting that had not yet happened. He told me not to worry, because the conclusion had already been written. I became anxious and tried to find the exit, but the corridors led only back to themselves. Eventually, I entered a large room full of people. They were completely silent, but I knew they were waiting for me to speak. At the center of the room, there was a child's chair. On the chair, there was no child. There was only a white coat, folded like a body. Someone whispered from behind me, "This is where the obedient ones sit until they are ready." I wanted to refuse, but I also wanted to belong. I stood there, unable to move in either direction. Then the walls began to breathe, slowly, rhythmically, as if the building had lungs. I realized something that terrified me. It was not that we were inside the Institute. The Institute was inside us. When Konstantinos finished, the last group fell into a silence that was not empty. It had density and weight. Some participants looked at the floor. Others smiled with what seemed like defensive recognition. Daphne, whose name had appeared in the dream, said she felt accused, even though she understood the dream was not literally about her. Konstantin, the other figure named, said that the image of the pre-written minutes made him think of every meeting at the Institute in which people spoke after the emotional conclusion had already been reached. A third participant wondered whether the folded white coat represented the analytic identity offered to candidates, but only once they had made themselves small enough to fill the child's chair. At this point, the dream ceased to be the private property of Konstantinos. It became a shared psychic text of the institution. The last group had transformed the personal nocturnal image into an institutional interpretation. Let's go to read the dream from an institutional perspective. The changing names on the doors of the dream's corridors suggested the instability of institutional identity, the way roles and meanings shift depending on who approaches them and from which position of power. The old papers that had to be signed by Daphne evoke the unconscious contracts that new members are asked to enter into, the inherited loyalties and silences they are expected to carry without having lived the history that produced them. The pre-written minutes recorded by Konstantin contains the illusion of a dialogue in institutions where the emotional conclusion has been reached long before the formal discussion begins. The child's chair and the folded white coat were the most condensed symbols. Together they spoke of dependency, professional idealization, infantilization, and the promise of analytic authority. One becomes an analyst, the dream suggested, by first occupying the place of the obedient child. The white coat, clinical, clean, authoritative, is not a word to the person who questions or transforms, but to the person who waits in the appropriate posture of submission. The coat is folded like a body, a garment that has already taken the shape of the self it expects to contain. Yet the most important image was the breathing building. The Institute was alive, but not alive in a creative sense. It was alive as an internal object, a psychic organism that had entered the participants and regulated their capacity to think, dissent, desire, and belong. The dream dramatized the central thesis of this presentation with disturbing precision. When institutional trauma is not processed, the institution becomes internalized as a living command. It does not merely organize behavior, it organizes psychic space. The last group made possible a shift from private anxiety to institutional reflection. Instead of interpreting Konstantinos' dream only intrapsychically as an expression of his personal ambivalence toward authority, the group allowed multiple interpretive levels to coexist simultaneously. Intrapsychically, the dream spoke of the candidate's fear of submission, dependency, exposure, and loss of self. Intersubjectively, it revealed the emotional field between candidate, facilitators, peers, and institutional representatives. Institutionally, it exposed the hidden contracts of training, the pressure to inherit memory without transforming it, and the danger that professional formation may become confused with psychic compliance. Psychohistorically, the dream linked the Institute to broader cultural histories in which belonging is often purchased through silence, obedience, and identification with power. Psychohistory and the temporal depth of institution now. This is where the work of psychohistory becomes essential. Psychohistory asks us to recognize that institutions do not emerge outside history. They are formed within cultures that have known war, dictatorship, exile, poverty, humiliation, patriarchy, migration, national defeat, and collective denial. These histories do not disappear when people enter professional life. They return in committees, curriculum, training rituals, exclusions, leadership styles, and fantasies of legitimacy. The psychoanalytic institution may unconsciously reproduce the very political forms it consciously rejects. The institutional unconscious, therefore, contains historical time. It contains the there and then that returns in the here and now. A contemporary conflict in a large group may carry the emotional residue of older social arrangements. A dispute about authority may reactivate histories of authoritarianism. A debate about inclusion may carry the trace of national exclusion. A complaint about silence may speak for generations who survived by not speaking. A fight between subgroups may repeat unresolved cultural splitting. The 2026 conference theme, Breaking Cycles of Violence, invites us to recognize that some of the most tenacious cycles are not those enacted between nations or generations, but those reproduced inside the very institutions formed to study and heal them. Another signal of siblings transference. The concept of institutional literacy becomes crucial here. Institutional literacy is the capacity to read the emotional, political, historical, and unconscious life of the institution without collapsing into paranoia, obedience, cynicism, or idealization. It is the capacity to ask, what is the institution making us carry? What is asking us not to do, not to know? Who is being used, and what is the institution making us carry? Who is being used as a container for disowned affect? Which subgroup has become the symptom of the whole? Which silence has become sacred? And which loyalty has become traumatic? Toward institutional self-analysis and repair. Repair cannot be reduced to apology, although apology may be necessary. Repair requires the transformation of institutional memory. It requires the movement from enactment to reflection, from repetition to symbolization, from obedience to participation. It requires that the institution become capable of dreaming itself differently. This is why the dream of Konstantinos is not merely an illustration or a clinical anecdote. It is a methodological proposal. The institution must develop the capacity to hear the dreams it produces in its members, to recognize in those dreams not only individual psychology, but its own unconscious self-portrayal. One of the persistent challenges observed in the large group interactions include those conducted within our institute and within the broader context of psychotherapy associations, is the tendency to conceptualize interpersonal and institutional conflicts through a rigid binary of abuser and abused. Such a framework risks oversimplifying the complex interplay of psychological, social, and institutional forces. The assumption that power is unidirectionally held by one subgroup while another remains in a position of dependency or weakness fails to capture the dynamic and fluid nature of human institutions. In traumatized institutions, people may be injured and injuring at the same time. They may resist power while unconsciously repeating its logic. They may seek repair while defending against the pain that repair requires. The last group, when ethically held, can become a transformative space. It allows the institution to encounter its own unconscious without immediately defending against it. It allows participants to discover that their private affects may be part of a larger historical field. It allows authority to be questioned without being destroyed. It allows dissent to become contribution rather than betrayal. It allows trauma to be recognized not as an identity, but as a structure that can be transformed. And now, the conclusion. The institution that cannot dream. The presentation concludes by suggesting that psychoanalytic institutions must develop a deeper capacity for institutional self-analysis. If they do not, they risk becoming monuments to the very unconscious processes they claim to interpret. The question is not whether institutions have an unconscious, they do. The question is whether they can create spaces where this unconscious can be spoken, dreamed, contested, mourned, and transformed. The dream of Konstantinos ended with walls that breathe. The institute goes inside its members. This image need not be only a diagnosis of pathology. It may also be an invitation. If the institution lives inside us, then the work of institutional transformation is inseparable from the work of personal and collective analysis. To change the institution, we must be willing to examine what we have agreed to carry on its behalf, what silences we have adopted as our own, and what future we are prepared to write rather than inherit. The institutional unconscious is not only the hidden life of the institution, it is also the place where the future of the institution is decided. When power colonizes the psyche, trauma governs belonging. When the institution becomes capable of listening to its own unconscious, capable in the deepest sense of dreaming, belonging may become something else. Not obedience, not submission, not inherited silence, but a shared and conflictual practice of psychic freedom. Thank you very much.
And now we can move on to our second presentation, that of Daphne Venetsanou. She is a licensed psychotherapist in Greece. She earned her degree in psychology from the University of Athens and DIRI, the American College of Greece, graduating with honors, and is currently completing her master's degree in psychotherapy at UOA. You helped me with that. She has completed the certified educational program in eating disorders at the University of Athens, as well as the postgraduate diploma in clinical skills based on relational psychoanalytic psychotherapy at the Institute for Relational and Group Psychotherapy. She provides psychotherapy to adults through her internship, private practice, and collaboration with the Psychotherapy Center Psychoepilepsy. Her professional experience also includes voluntary involvement in sexual abuse prevention research. Committed to continuous learning, she regularly attends seminars, particularly in relational psychoanalysis and group psychotherapy, and presents her work at national and international conferences. Her work includes a publication titled A Candidate Contemplating Institutionally Set Boundaries by the Eastern Group Psychotherapy Society in Group 2025, as well as co-authorship in the third collective Greek volume on relational psychoanalysis and group dynamics, published in 2025. She is a member of the International Association for Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, IR, and the American Group Psychotherapy Association, AGPA. Please, Daphne.
Thank you, Gabriella. I would also like to thank the association for having us and all of you who joined our panel. Let me just share my screen. Can you see the document?
No.
No? Okay.
No?
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you.
It's coming. It's coming. Just a second. Not there. Yes, that now is perfect.
Perfect. My paper is entitled The Large Group as a Political Body, Anxiety, Obedience to the Production of Enemies. This presentation examines the large group as a political formation in which sociopolitical dynamics emerge not as abstract themes, but as lived emotional realities. Drawing on 8 large groups conducted during this year's International Psychoanalytic Symposium, organized by the Institute of Relational and Group Psychotherapy, the analysis explores how the scale and intensity of the setting expose the unconscious foundations of political life. Across the groups, experiences of fear, vulnerability, and belonging became organized through processes of splitting, obedience, projection, and enemy formation. By integrating psychoanalytic theory with close observation of group processes, the aim is not to diagnose dysfunction, but to illuminate how groups imagine authority, negotiate danger, and search for coherence when symbolic capacity falters. The following analysis explores these processes as they unfolded, showing how the large groups become both a laboratory of political unconscious and a setting in which new forms of collective agency can take shape. To understand how these dynamics unfold in the large group, it is necessary to look beneath explicit interaction and into the unconscious processes that organize collective life. Klein's account of the paranoid schizoid position clarifies how groups under pressure manage anxiety by splitting experience into idealized good and persecutory bad elements, creating temporary coherence through simplification. Unwanted or frightening aspects of the self are expelled into external figures through projective identification, in which disavowed feelings are lodged into another person who is then treated as their embodiment. In the large group, these mechanisms scale up rapidly. Individuals or subgroups become containers for aggression, vulnerability, or confusion that the group cannot tolerate. Beyond's theory of basic assumptions explains how groups regress under pressure by abandoning reflective functioning and organizing themselves around primitive certainties. In the dependency assumption, the group unconsciously constructs the fantasy of an omnipotent leader who will provide protection, direction, and meaning. Members relinquish agency and critical thought in exchange for the emotional safety of submission, making obedience a defensive solution rather than a reflective choice. In the fight-flight assumption, the group behaves as if its primary task were to preserve itself by fighting or by taking flight. Threats are rapidly identified, ambivalence collapses into polarized thinking, and minor frustration are amplified into collective grievances. Across both assumptions, symbolic capacity deteriorates, and the group oscillates between hostility, apathy, and demands for rescue. Under heightened anxiety, the group oscillates between aggregation, marked by withdrawal and detachment, and massification, marked by fusion and the loss of differentiation. These bipolar movements, rooted in traumatogenic processes and the fear of annihilation on one pole and the fear of abandonment on the other, intensify the splitting and projective processes. Trauma does not merely heighten anxiety, but can induce a state of psychic paralysis in which symbolic functioning falters, thinking becomes suspended, and group becomes vulnerable to fragmentation. At the scale of the large group, incohesion accelerates the displacement of fear into external figures, intensified by what Hoppers describes as an encapsulation, a psychic sealing off of unbearable experiences when the containing environment fails, which can offer temporary protection, but if prolonged, leads to chronic isolation of experience. This defensive formation can sediment into the social unconscious, becoming transgenerationally transmitted through unworked mourning, pale dependency, and the repetition of defensive enclosure. Scapegoating operates as the most visible expression of this dynamic. The group evacuates unbearable affects, shame, rivalry, pale dependency, and annihilation anxiety into members or subgroups that become the repositories of what it cannot bear to know about itself. Activated most intensely by experiences of separation or abandonment, scapegoating temporarily stabilizes the incohesive group by organizing anxiety around a designated target, binding members together through shared hostility, while simultaneously isolating the chosen figure, repeating early relational trauma within the group matrix through both vertical and horizontal transferences and deeply shaped by sibling rivalry. The concept of the group matrix clarifies how meaning continues to circulate even when coherence falters. Fulks and Anthony describe the matrix as the shared psychological medium, the network of communication, fantasy, and unconscious resonance through which individuals' experience is shaped and fundamentally constituted rather than merely expressed. The individual is best understood as a nodal point within a web of interrelations, always vulnerable to dissolution back into collective modes of experience. In the large group, this matrix becomes increasingly volatile. The condenser phenomenon intensifies where the ordinary containing function of small group recognition are unavailable. Anxieties propagate rapidly through resonance, and the mirror function, the process through which other group members reflect back aspects of the self that the individual cannot see or access on their own, breaks down, amplifying rather than counteracting distortion. The group's emotional field organizes around defensive simplification, locating disturbance in particular individual or subgroups who become containers for disowned affect. The dynamics of the social unconscious illuminate how shared fantasies and anxieties circulate beneath awareness. Weinberg defines it as the co-constructed shared unconscious of members of a certain social system, such as community, society, nation, or culture, comprising shared anxieties, fantasies, defenses, myths, and memories. In the large group, the weakened container and fluid boundaries exposed with unusual clarity. Assumptions crystallize, disavowals intensify, and social defenses propagate rapidly through the foundation matrix that even strangers implicitly share. Volkan deepens the picture by showing how transgenerational transmission, chosen glories, and chosen traumas shape the shared emotional field long before the large group convenes, creating the background against which members implicitly ask, "Who are we now?" When activated, past injuries and glories undergo a time collapse, making historical events feel psychically present rather than remembered, collapsing the distance between past and present, and flooding the group with affects that belong to another time but are experienced as immediate and urgent. This collapse intensifies splitting, projection, and the search of protective authority as the group reaches for the sanctity of enemy for images to manage what cannot be symbolized. Volkan's concept of externalization describes how groups project unwanted aspects of their identity onto suitable targets, creating reservoirs that carry disavowed fears and vulnerabilities. What the group cannot bear to know about itself is deposited elsewhere, and the designated carrier becomes both necessary and expendable, held at a distance that simultaneously preserves group cohesion and forecloses genuine encounter. At the level of individual experience, the egocentric sociocentric link, Biran's term for the fragile balance between individuality and group belonging, becomes destabilized under these conditions. The individual either retreats into grandiose self-sufficiency or submits to the group's demand for fusion. Turquette's distinction between the singleton and membership individual maps the same tension. The singleton retains separatedness, whereas the membership individual relinquishes individuality as collective anxiety arises, producing a defensive oneness in which sameness is equated with safety and difference with threat. Dissent becomes psychically costly and identity reorganized around defensive cohesion rather than symbolic thought, a withdrawal for judgment that Arendt recognized as sheer thoughtlessness, making compliance feel safer than reflection and enabling the projection of danger into designated others. The institutional unconscious shapes how fantasies about authority and legitimacy operate beneath the surface. Charalambides uses this concept to describe the unspoken assumptions through which groups imagine order, hierarchy, and protection, even in settings that explicitly aim to suspend such structures. Under heightened anxiety, participants align with imagined centers of authority, inhabit unconsciously assigned roles, and absorb anxieties the group cannot hold. The institutional unconscious demanding obedience, civility, or premature harmony, narrowing the field of possible thought. The Marais concept of koinonia offers a model for recovering symbolic dialogue in the large group, a shared conversational space in which speech becomes decontaminated from retaliatory impulses, stereotypes, and primitive assumptions. The Marais describes the movement from hate through dialogue to culture, emphasizing that cultural formation depends on the group's ability to tolerate difference rather than collapse it into premature harmony. Koinonia represents the collective mental space in which the pressures of institutional conscience can be metabolized, allowing the large group to move forward towards reflective agency. I move on now on the analysis of the 8 large groups. Across the 8 large groups, foreign line in English and foreign person in Greek, the emotional atmosphere was marked from the outset by diffuse but unmistakable anxiety. Participants entered with heightened vigilance, uncertainty about norms, and a sense of exposure that quickly became a shared field condition. The earliest contributions were tentative or framed as questions about how this works, revealing how fears shaped the group's capacity to engage long before explicit conflict appeared. Sociopolitical dynamics entered the large group not as explicit topics, but as emotional formations. Rather than discussing politics, the group enacted political life through patterns of authority, obedience, and exclusion. This was visible when participants began debating whether they should be more analytic, whether they should stop grieving, or whether they were doing it right or wrong, appeals to an imagined authority whose standards the group felt compelled to meet. A particularly charged sequence unfolded when participants struggled to define who we were. The repeated question, who is we, exposed the fragility of the group's imagined unity, revealing oscillations between fusion and fragmentation. Several participants described pain, regression, and the sense that the group had become childless, caught between pleasing imagined parental figures and rebelling against them. As anxiety intensified, obedience emerged as a defensive response to chaos. Participants gravitated towards norms they believed were required of them. Maybe it's required of us, one said. I don't know if it's compatible with the group, another said. Even though no such requirements had been articulated, a dynamic that quickly took on familiar form. One participant described the facilitator as like a father, another as the mother, and the rest as psychoanalytic brothers, life projections that organized authority and belonging through primitive identifications rather than reflective thought. Enemy formation also played a central role in regulating collective anxiety. In one online session, a younger participant who frequently used the chat became a lightning rod for frustration. For some, the chat felt natural and clarifying, while others experienced it as intrusive or aggressive. This split exposed a generational gap that amplified the group's unease, and as tension accumulated, irritation crystallized around the participant, who eventually withdrew. The palpable relief that followed revealed how the group used him to absorb its diffuse emotional turbulence. These individuals are not targeted because of their actual behavior, but because they could not hold aspects of the group's emotional life that could not be tolerated collectively. As the discussion turned to fathers, mothers, and the fear of being a bad father or a bad mother, projection intensified. One participant described the painful ambivalence of identifying with the father, whether such identification was deadly or creative, while another reflected that nobody wants to be a bad father or a bad mother, not even a bad therapist, revealing how anxieties about responsibility and destructiveness circulated beneath the surface. The discussion of men as both protectors and perpetrators deepened the group's movement into a soldier matrix. Participants spoke of cycles in which men are idolized as heroes and condemned as slaughterers, and of the societal tendency to project destructiveness onto men so we are not. The group's difficulty holding the idea that someone can be a hero and a slaughterer at the same time revealed the challenge of sustaining ambivalence in a field dominated by splitting. The avoidance of explicit political discussion operated as a collective defense against escalating anxiety. Although the material was saturated with political meaning, the group consistently shifted back into personal narratives whenever these approached contemporary geopolitics, with international participants gathered during an acutely tense sociopolitical period, naming concrete political events risk intensifying fragmentation, rivalry, and exposure. Avoidance was therefore a regulatory maneuver aimed at preserving cohesion in the face of potentially overwhelming political anxieties, allowing shared cultural residues to circulate effectively without confronting their direct sociopolitical referents. Rather than interpreting these dynamics as failures of containment, they can be understood as manifestation of groups' political unconscious. Psychoanalytic work with large groups cannot be neutral or sanitized. Collective fantasies, historical traumas, enemy images, and ideological identification inevitably surface and cannot be managed through smoothing techniques or quick attempts at calm. The psychoanalytic stance requires tolerating political anxiety and remain within a zone of instability where conflict, contradiction, and multiple identification can be thought. Premature harmony signals symbolic collapse, a retreat into roles, stereotypes, and mass identification that conceals anxiety rather than metabolizing it. Large groups activate collective traumas, purification fantasies, and hostile projections. The task is not to erase these phenomena, but to hold them in mind, enabling a more mature cohesion grounded in the capacity to hold multiple voices, conflicts, and historical memories together. Despite the turbulence, the large groups also revealed the capacity for mature hope. Hope appeared when the group could tolerate uncertainty, acknowledge loss, and remain in relation despite conflict, not as wishful optimism, but in Hopper's terms as the willingness to exercise the transcendent imagination within the dramatogenic process, forged through the transmuting internalization of good enough relating. After a tense exchange, one participant admitted feeling both frustrated and curious, and the group paused rather than reacting defensively, allowing complexity to stand. In another moment, a participant confessed to feeling lost, and several others nodded in recognition, creating a brief sense of self-vulnerability, the kind of being in dialogue that Hopper identifies as the basic condition for making links and rendering experience meaningful. These moments did not resolve the group's difficulties, but showed its movement from reactive obedience toward reflective agency. Psychoanalytic work with large groups requires resisting the impulse to close chaos too quickly. Thinking needs space, and that space is often charged. Mature hope, as distinct from its infantile form, does not collapse when thwarted by yells instead of to disappointment and vulnerable sorrow, from which new hope can emerge. When premature harmony is resisted, the group can shift from basic assumption functioning to genuine work group activity, the authentic cohesion within which Hopper argues mature hope alone becomes possible, where symbolic thinking and political subjectivity can be explored rather than reproduced. The large group makes visible how collective experience is shaped by unconscious forces that organize authority, belonging, and danger before they take symbolic form. These dynamics were not interpersonal disturbances, but expression of the political unconscious, patterns of projection, identification, and inherited fantasy that shaped the group from within. Yet the groups also saw that they can move beyond this defensive formation. When participants could pause, tolerate discomfort, and remain in relation without collapsing into premature unity, symbolic thinking re-emerged, and members encounter one another as subjects rather than roles. Large groups thus becomes both a site where political anxieties are enacted and a space where reflective agency can take shape, a setting in which the emotional foundation of shared social experience become available for thought and where the possibility of a more mature dialogical form of cohesion is made possible. Thank you.
Okay, so welcome back again to our second hour of our beautiful panel on group analysis and group dynamics. I would like to introduce Konstantinos Dritsoulas. He's a psychologist licensed to practice and maintains a private practice in the Neos Cosmos area of Athens. He's a graduate of Canterbury Christ Church University and completed his postgraduate studies in clinical psychology at the University of Essex. He trained and holds a postgrad diploma in clinical skills in relational psychoanalytic psychotherapy from the Greek Institute for Relational and Group Psychotherapy. Since 2022, he has been in training in group analysis at the Hellenic Network of Group Analysis. In addition to his private practice, he is also a clinical associate at Psychoplepsy, where he conducts individual psychotherapy sessions with adults and facilitates adult psychotherapy groups. He has been continuously engaged in both individual and group therapy since 2013. At the same time, he is an individual supervision for his one-on-one clinical work and in group supervision for the groups he facilitates. He actively participates in conferences, symposiums, and professional events, both in Greece and abroad. Finally, he is a member of the International Association of Relational Psychoanalysis Psychotherapy and the American Group for Psychotherapy Association, and hopefully soon on psychohistory.
Of course.
Please, Konstantinos.
Thank you so much, Gabriela, for the introduction. Before I begin, I would like to share that I'm truly delighted to be among my beloved co-presenters and all of you here today. Let me share my screen.
Just a bit bigger if you can have it.
Is it okay?
Yes, I hope
Okay.
so.
The title of my presentation is Trauma as Ideology, How History Repeats Itself Through the Group Mind. The central question running through this paper is not what a group remembers of its trauma, but what happens when it cannot remember it. I approach this question through my own experience of 8 large groups held at the third Pan-Hellenic Conference of Relational and Group Psychotherapy, organized by the Institute for Relational and Group Psychotherapy under the theme Social Unconscious and Paternity, Relational Psychoanalysis and Group Psychotherapy. When trauma cannot be moved, it tends to repeat not as conscious recollection or narrative, but as the way an individual or group learns to see and experience the world. It appears through the body, through rigid modes of thought, and through an urgent need for certainty and control, particularly when uncertainty seems unbearable. As Earl Hopper would argue, when collective trauma cannot be symbolized and processed, it shifts from the domain of experience to the domain through which reality is organized. Gradually, it ceases to be felt as trauma and begins to function as self-evident truth, as a way of perceiving the world, the other, and the sense of belonging. In this sense, trauma is transformed into ideology, becoming a system of certainties that organizes group experience rather than processing it. And precisely because these certainties are not recognized as traumatic residues, but as self-evident truths, the group tends to reproduce them, repeating historical patterns without recognizing them as such. This is the double movement examined in this paper, showing how trauma becomes ideology and how ideology in turn produces repetition. This transition is also connected to the concept of the social unconscious developed by L. Hopper, which refers to that shared unconscious psychic domain that takes shape within groups and large group societies and shapes how members feel, connect, and make meaning of their experience. It is a common psychic field that emerges through the group's relationship and unconscious interactions, a space where forms of experience that cannot easily be symbolized or processed take up residence. In this paper, I analyzed two clinical moments from the large groups of the symposium, namely the scapegoating effect and the splitting that followed, and the trap of anger in place of mourning in relation to the vertical axis. In both cases, the question running through the analysis is the same, namely, when does a group stop thinking what it is living and begin repeating as the only truth, the paternal function and dramatic organization. In contemporary psychoanalytic thought, the father is understood not mainly as a biological or social entity, but as a symbolic function, namely what Lacan characteristically called the name of the father. This structure introduces the differentiation between infant and mother, breaks the dyadic relationship, and opens the field for relations to the third. Within groups, when the paternal function fails, or more precisely, when it is experienced as having failed, the group faces what Bion described as the basic assumption of dependency. It regresses to primary defensive operations, seeking an omnipotent leader in the person of one member or searching for an internal enemy onto whom responsibility can be projected for the group's inability to function. René Caes developed this thinking by proposing that the group is not merely a collection of individuals, but a shared psychic processing space. Through the concept of the group psychic apparatus, he described how the group is called upon to contain, connect, and metabolize the experiences, anxieties, and emotional states that frequently exceed the capacities of the individual subject. When the function related to boundary, differentiation, and symbolization have been traumatized, however, the group struggles to tolerate otherness and psychic tension. Rather than operating as a processing space, it may become organized around rigid defenses, merger tendencies, or processes of exclusion. In the same framework, Vamik-Volkan added the transgenerational and collective dimension of trauma, describing how certain historically traumatic experiences are kept alive within groups and transmitted across generations. Through the concept of chosen traumas, he showed how trauma can become a central organizer of collective identity, not as living memory that has been processed, but as an unconscious inheritance requiring preservation and repetition. This repetition is not a conscious choice, but rather the way the group reproduces what it could not mourn. The vertical and horizontal axis. The vertical axis refers to the group's relationship with authority, with the leader, with the therapist, the institution, and the symbolic father. It is the axis of hierarchy, dependency, the expectation of salvation, or resistance to whoever holds the frame. Bion and Fuchs described both the dynamics of dependency and counterdependency as two different expressions of the same difficulty, namely the group's inability to trust its own capacity to think, contain anxiety, and generate meaning through collective process. Turquet observed that in the large group, anxieties about identity loss and experience of threat are frequently organized around the relationship with leadership, which is called upon to contain expectations, fears, and fantasies that exceed its actual function. The horizontal axis refers to the relations among peers, that is the sibling dimension of group life. It is the space where envy, rivalry, solidarity, and the need for recognition merge, while the fantasy of uniqueness is disrupted. The group is called upon to process the fact that the subject is neither unique nor privileged, but coexists with others who also desire, claim, and seek a place within the shared field. Neri emphasizes that the experience of belonging is never free of ambivalence, as the need for participation and closeness coexists with anxieties related to comparison, rivalry, and exposure to the gaze of others. The, the group tendency to avoid the horizontal axis by displacing tension onto the vertical constitutes, in this sense, one of the most common forms of ideological organization, one we will encounter in both clinical examples. The first example, the clinical material. In one of the symposium's large groups, an intense collective tension was noticeable from early on, a tension that could not easily be named. The group functioned as if in a state of splitting. One subgroup seemed to hold a sense of knowledge and closeness to the co-conductors and the institution, while other members remained on the periphery, silent or hesitant. The tension was not expressed verbally, but was more bodily, atmospheric, and diffuse. In this climate, a subgroup began to occupy a particular position. Its interventions were frequent, childlike, aggressive, and often served interruption rather than collective processing of what was happening in the here and now. Members received others' words and their own with irony or dismissal, shifting the meaning of contributions in ways that disrupted collective processing. The group began to react, initially with mild irritation, then with more direct expressions of resistance. Characteristic was the moment when certain members began attributing the subgroup's stance to some particular characteristic of its members, often through humorous hints. Gradually, a shared narrative formed that positioned the subgroup as the different or the problematic. The complexity of the process was reduced to a simplifying explanation through which the problem acquired a specific bearer, while the group itself was relieved of the need to think about its own participation in generating the tension. At this point, trauma ceased to function as an experience demanding processing and began to function as an ideological organization of reality, a self-evident certainty about who is the problem that no longer needed to be examined. At the core of the splitting lay a deeper, largely unverbalized question about who bears responsibility for what is happening inside the group and what the co-conductor's non-intervention means. Part of the group experienced the co-conductors as insufficiently protective, while other members treated any possible intervention as restrictive. Tension shifted from a conflict among members to the group relationship with leadership, organizing contradictory expectations toward the vertical axis, namely the need for protection and containment on one side and the fear of control on the other. The problematic subgroup was not simply the group's problem, but what the group itself produced. The aggression and ironic stance its member expressed could be seen as a condensation of elements circulating more widely in the group field, including aggressive tendencies, the need to challenge leadership, and the wish to move away from positions of dependency. Rather than exploring what this behavior expressed, the problem was located exclusively in the subgroup. This displacement functioned defensively and ideologically, producing a certainty the group did not question. This movement was not accidental, it was familiar. The group reproduced a historically familiar way of managing internal tension through the creation of a scapegoat, the exclusion of unwanted aspects of itself, and temporary relief from tension. The participants, psychoanalysts and psychotherapists themselves, did not choose this solution, but recognized it as a self-evident. This is precisely what makes the moment clinically significant, for ideology does not appear as ideology, but as a common sense. This is what Hopper describes as the transformation of unprocessed material into an organizing principle of group life, whereby experience ceases to an object of thought and begins to organize the group's thinking. The second example. In a different large group, few days later, the theme of the paternal function emerged in another way. Discussion organized quickly around issues of authority, protection, and disappointment, and anger was intense and easily articulated in phrases such as, "They do not listen to us, they do not trust us, there is a hierarchy that goes unacknowledged." Nearly every intervention referred directly or indirectly to the relationship with a paternal figure, one who in the here and now was represented by the co-conductors. The feeling inside the group was often suffocating, as every attempt at connection among members seemed to collapse quickly and return to the relationship with the leadership. Pauses were brief, interventions charged, and the atmosphere seemed to exclude the possibility of staying with uncertainty. At a crucial moment, several members began to speak of the barefoot, an image of freedom, release from burdens, and equality. When we are all barefoot, we are equal, for pain, ground, and vulnerability are shared. However, one member offered a different reading, suggesting that if we wear shoes, immediately the question arises of who wears the most expensive or the most beautiful pair. This observation introduced difference and rivalry precisely where the fantasy of undifferentiated equality had prevailed and briefly opened the possibility of a turn toward the horizontal axis. The group did not follow this thread. The observation was left unexplored, and the discussion returned quickly to the relationship with the paternal figure. Anger toward the father is psychically less costly than mourning. Anger maintains the relationship, for it implies there is someone there who is to blame. The group thus remains oriented toward the paternal figure, seeking in it either the solution or the responsibility. Mourning, by contrast, requires acknowledging that what the group seeks does not exist, and that uncertainty, ambivalence, and difference are integral elements of group life that cannot be delegated to an idealized paternal function. Bowlby described how difficulty accepting loss is often accompanied by persistent searching for the lost object. In the large group, this manifests as persistent investment in the vertical axis. The fantasy of the barefoot functioned precisely in this way, as an image promising to abolish difference, eliminate rivalry, and restore a pre-differential harmony. What Kerberg calls the ideology of equality, meaning the illusion that if visible differences are erased, envy is erased too. It is ideology in the precise sense, a certainty that protects against thinking rather than activating it. Because it was not recognized as such, the group returned to it, repeating the fantasy rather than processing it. The group appeared to be organizing defensively against three interrelated elements, namely its own feeling of hostility toward the paternal figure, the inability to mourn the absence of an idealized paternal figure, and the possibility of engaging with the horizontal axis, which would have revealed the envy, rivalry, and experiences of marginalization circulating in the field. Both clinical examples converge on the same question, namely what happens when a group cannot mourn. The answer that appeared in both groups, that unprocessed material does not disappear but is transformed into a common truth. The scapegoat becomes a self-evident interpretation, and the fantasy of equality becomes an unquestionable value. Trauma becomes ideology, and the ideology is reproduced, repeated, and transmitted. In this way, history does not return as a memory that can be processed, but as a way of organizing the present that is not recognized as historically transmitted. Mourning as a clinical task is not limited to the acceptance of a particular loss. Rather, it concerns the group's capacity to remain in contact with difference and uncertainty without resorting to truths that provide reassurance at the expense of thought. This requires a group space sufficiently stable to contain contradictions and ambivalence. The significance of this challenge extends beyond the boundaries of the therapeutic group, as it concerns the ways in which every collectivity metabolizes or fails to metabolize the traumas, losses, and contradiction it inherits. Within this context, Charalambides argues that psychic experience cannot be fully understood outside the multiple levels of relationships and belonging within which the subject is embedded. The individual participates simultaneously in familial, group, social, and historical matrices, all of which co-constitute subjective experience as well as the unconscious processes that emerge within therapeutic and institutional settings. The large groups of the symposium demonstrated that when trauma cannot become an object of thought and mourning, it tends to be transformed into ideology, that is, into a way of organizing experience that offers coherence but restricts complexity. The clinical state of the large group is the possibility of transforming this repetition into thought, as the large group offers a rare space where this movement can become visible, where history can, if only momentarily, be recognized as history and not merely lived as destiny. Thank you so much.
Now we will go to the last presentation of our today panel. Hi, Paulina. Happy to see you here. I will invite Konstantinos Mouchalos, and I will present him. He's a relational psychoanalytic and group psychotherapist based in Athens. He studied psychology at DIRI, the American College of Greece, and trained in cognitive analytic therapy, later specializing in relational psychoanalysis and Yalomian group psychotherapy. He furthered his education at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens in medical psychology, psychotherapy, and couples counseling, and completed additional training in psychoanalyst first aid at Johns Hopkins University, UCLA, and Duke University. Since 2016, he has maintained a private practice in Glyfara and is the founder and director of the Hellenic Institute for Mental Health and Psychotherapy. He is a faculty member of the Institute for Relational and Group Psychotherapy and a member of several international psychoanalytic and psychotherapy associations. And he serves as co-chair of the IARP Candidates Committee. His clinical and theoretical work focuses on authority, freedom, enactment, and symbolization in group and large group psychotherapy. His article, Unthought No, Navigating Perceptions of Tyranny and Democracy in Group Psychotherapy, was published in the journal Group in 2025. So please, Konstantinos.
Good morning, Gabriela and everyone. Before I begin, I would like to congratulate and thank the presenters of my panel, Konstantinos, Daphne, and Stavros. And of course, I would like to thank you, Gabriela, for your invitation and support, and the Institute for Relational and Group Psychotherapy for creating opportunities for dialogue and learning altogether, and of course, the organizers of this conference for bringing us together. The title of my paper is From Submission to Symbolization, the Large Group Against Reenactment. I will start sharing my screen. Can you all see?
Perfect.
Nice. The large group occupies a unique place within group analytic and relational and psychoanalytic thinking. Unlike smaller therapeutic groups where interpersonal dynamics can often be observed and reflected upon more directly, the large group exposes participants to broader social, historical, and collective forces that frequently operate beyond conscious awareness. In this sense, the large group functions as a living laboratory of the social unconscious, relieving how collective anxieties, traumas, and conflicts become enacted in the present moment. This perspective is rooted in group analytic and psychoanalytic traditions. Fuchs emphasized the relational matrix of human experience, while Bion described the regressive tendencies that emerge in groups under stress. For many participants, entering a large group involves confronting experiences of uncertainty, anonymity, and loss of individual agency. The increased complexity of interactions, the absence of familiar structures, and the presence of multiple social identities create conditions in which primitive anxieties may emerge. Under such circumstances, participants often oscillate between silence, submission, idealization of authority, and impulsive action. These responses may appear as obstacles to dialogue, yet they simultaneously reveal the very psychological processes that the large groups brings into view. This paper explores the transformative potential of the large group as a space capable of moving from submission and reenactment toward symbolization and shared meaning. Drawing upon the author's participations in 8 large groups across international psychoanalytic conferences, this paper reflects upon the conditions under which collective trauma can become thinkable rather than repeatedly enacted. The central argument advanced here is that the large group becomes therapeutic not when conflict disappears, but when participants can remain engaged with conflict long enough for symbolization to emerge. From this perspective, enactment and regression are not failures of the process but necessary stages through which collective experience may eventually become available for reflection and meaning-making. The social unconscious and collective trauma, some theoretical background. Hopper describes the social unconscious as consisting of shared social arrangements, cultural assumptions, historical traumas, and collective anxieties that influence individual and group experience while remaining largely outside awareness. Within the large group, these unconscious dimensions often become visible through repetitive patterns of interaction, emotional contagion, and collective enactments. Collective trauma occupies a central place within this framework. Traumatic experiences that remain insufficiently processed do not simply disappear. Instead, they tend to return in disguised forms through repetition, polarization, scapegoating, and the search of certainty. The large group often becomes the stage upon which these unresolved experiences are replayed. Hopper argues that traumatic experiences may lead groups towards stages of aggression and massification. In aggregation, these individuals become psychologically isolated despite physical proximity. In massification, individual differences collapse into collective emotional states characterized by conformity and submission. Both conditions limit the group's capacity for reflective functioning and symbolic thought. From a relational perspective, trauma can also be understood as a disruption in the capacity to maintain meaningful connection under conditions of emotional stress. When traumatic anxieties dominate, individuals and groups frequently abandon curiosity and reflection in favor of defensive certainty. Thought becomes replaced by action, complexity by simplification, and dialogue by enactment. One of the most striking observations within large groups is the recurrent emergence of submission. Participants often seek authority figures who can restore order, reduce uncertainty, and provide definitive answers. At other times, submission appears through silence, withdrawal, or passive compliance. Although submission may initially appear pathological, it can also be understood as a defensive adaptation to overwhelming emotional experience. Faced with uncertainty and anxiety, surrendering responsibility to external authority may provide temporary relief. The cost, however, is a reduction in agency and reflective capacity. The paradox of freedom and authority has been widely explored within psychoanalytic thought. Submission may provide temporary relief from uncertainty and emotional pain, though at the cost of agency and reflection. As previously discussed by Mouchalos, perceptions of democracy and tyranny within group psychotherapy frequently emerge not as objective descriptions of leadership, but as projections shaped by participants' unconscious expectations and relational histories. Similar dynamics can be observed within the large group, where authority figures may become recipients of collective fantasies regarding control, freedom, dependence, and responsibility. Within contemporary relational psychoanalysis, enactment is understood as the emergence of unconscious relational patterns within lived interaction, rather than being viewed solely as resistance or pathology. Enactments provide access to emotional realities that cannot yet be symbolized. Stern suggests that enactments often emerge from aspects of experience that remain insufficiently formulated in thought and language. From this perspective, enactment represents not simply a failure of reflection, but an attempt to communicate emotional realities that have not yet become symbolically available. Similarly, Benjamin argues that transformation frequently depends upon the emergence of a relational third, a shared psychological space in which previously polarized positions can become subjects of mutual recognition rather than mutual opposition. In the large group, enactments frequently occur at a collective level. Members may repeatedly recreate dynamics of exclusion, dependency, competition, idealization, or submission without recognizing that they are participating in these processes. The group acts before it can think. When anxiety intensifies, the capacity of reflection diminishes. Participants become increasingly invested in action, certainty, and immediate solutions. Emotional complexity is sacrificed in favor of defensive organization. Under these conditions, the group may become trapped within cycles of repetition that reproduce rather than transform traumatic experience. Yet, enactment itself contains transformative potential because enactments make unconscious dynamics visible. they create opportunities for reflection once sufficient containment becomes available. The challenge lies not in preventing enactment, but in developing conditions that allow it to be thought about. One illustrative moment occurred when, in a large group, a woman, widely perceived as physically fragile and unassuming, abruptly struck the participant seated next to her with her elbow at the very moment he attempted to speak for the first time. She simultaneously gestured him to remain silent. Shh. She did. The participant was physically imposing, making the interaction particularly striking. Yet, what proved most remarkable was not the act itself, but the group's response. Despite the visible nature of the incident, it was in the very center of the large group that happened. The discussion continued as if nothing unusual had occurred. No participant referred to the event, and attention quickly shifted elsewhere. Only later did reflection emerge regarding the group's apparent inability to acknowledge what had taken place. The collective silence surrounding the incident appeared to reveal a shared difficulty in recognizing aggression, conflict, and power dynamics when they emerge in unexpected forms. The group's assumptions regarding strength, vulnerability, authority, and entitlement to speak seem to remain largely unexamined in the moment. In this sense, the absence of response became as meaningful as the act itself. What initially remained unspeakable gradually became available for thought, illustrating how enactment may persist outside awareness until the group develops the capacity to reflect upon what it has collectively disavowed. The reflections presented in this paper emerged from the author's participation, my participation, in 8 large groups conducted within the context of international psychoanalytic conferences across different countries and cultural settings. Process observations and thematic reflections were reviewed retrospectively in order to identify recurring patterns related to submission, enactment, and symbolization. The paper presents a theoretically informed reflection on recurring processes observed across these large group experiences, focusing on how collective emotional realities become organized and transformed within the group matrix. Across multiple sessions, periods of heightened anxiety were associated with increased passivity and dependence upon authority. Participants frequently expressed wishes for stronger structure, clearer guidance, or definitive interpretations. At such moments, uncertainty became difficult to tolerate. Rather than remaining curious about emerging tensions, members often sought immediate resolution. Silence functioned as a form of collective withdrawal, while occasional emotional outbursts represents attempts to discharge anxiety through action. Notably, these dynamics often emerged following discussions involving social conflict, political polarization, identity differences, or collective trauma. The group appeared to oscillate between fragmentation and fusion, struggling to maintain a reflective middle ground. In another large group, following an emotionally charged discussion concerning war, collective trauma, and social responsibility, participants increasingly turned toward the facilitators with demands for clarity and direction. Several members expressed frustration that no clear position was being offered, while others withdrew into silence. For a period of time, the group appeared organized around a shared wish for centrality and leadership. As the discussion continued, however, attention gradually shifted from what the facilitators should provide to what participants themselves were experiencing. Feelings of fear, helplessness, anger, and vulnerability began to emerge. The group's focus moved from seeking answers to exploring the emotional meanings underlying the demand for answers. What had initially appeared as a struggle over authority gradually became an opportunity for collective reflection and symbolization. A different process became visible when participants were able to remain emotionally engaged without seeking premature closure. Rather than rushing towards solutions, members gradually began describing their experiences, associations, and emotional reactions in greater depth. Listening increased and previously rigid positions softened, allowing curiosity to emerge where certainty had dominated. Experiences that initially appeared threatening became increasingly available for reflection and connection with broader personal and social realities. In another large group, a prolonged period of silence initially generated frustration among several participants who questioned whether anything meaningful was happening. As the silence gradually became a topic of reflection rather than something to be eliminated, members began associating it with experiences of exclusion, uncertainty, cultural difference, and fear of speaking. What had first been experienced as an absence of process slowly revealed itself as part of the process itself. The silence became symbolized, allowing participants to explore its emotional and relational meanings rather than simply react against it. Symbolization emerged not through interpretation imposed by leaders, but through the gradual co-constructions of meaning among participants themselves. Perhaps the most important finding concerned the role of relational containment. Transformative moments did not occur because conflict disappeared. Rather, they emerged when conflict could be sustained without immediate resolution. The facilitator's capacity to tolerate uncertainty appeared particularly important. Instead of rushing to restore order, they remained present to confusion, disagreement, and emotional intensity. This stance communicated confidence in the group's capacity to think, even when thinking temporarily collapsed. As participants experienced their anxieties being held rather than eliminated, they gradually developed greater capacity to remain present to difficult emotional realities. Symbolization became possible because the group no longer needed to defend itself through constant action. These moments may be understood as the emergence of a transitional space in which collective anxieties become available for reflection. The observation presented here supports Hopper's understanding of the large group as a space in which collective trauma becomes visible through regression, enactment, and basic assumption functioning. They also resonate strongly with contemporary relational perspectives that emphasize the transformative value of staying with uncertainty rather than eliminating it. Rather than viewing enactment as a failure of the large group process, the present reflections suggest that enactment may constitute the very pathway through which collective symbolization becomes possible. A central implication concerns the relationship between submission and symbolization. Submission can be understood as a defensive attempt to escape uncertainty. Symbolization, by contrast, requires tolerating uncertainty long enough for meaning to emerge. The large group offers an alternative possibility. By creating a space in which uncertainty can be collectively tolerated, it enables participants to develop capacities for reflection, responsibility, and agency. Rather than seeking external authorities to resolve tension, members gradually become capable of participating in the co-construction of meaning. This process also reflects Charalambides' emphasis on meaningful relationships as the foundation from which liberty emerges. Similarly, Charalambides highlights the defensive pull toward submission as a means of avoiding psychic pain. The observation presented here suggests that submission and reenactment represent attempts to escape emotional reality, whereas symbolization requires moving through emotional reality. The large group becomes transformative when it supports this movement. The movement from submission and reenactment toward symbolization may also be understood through Nietzsche's concept of the anti-group. Submission withdrawal, attacks on thinking, and the search for certainty can be understood as anti-group processes that seek to avoid emotional complexity. When recognized and reflected upon, however, they may become sources of growth and transformation. An additional implication concerns the large group's capacity to sustain contact across difference. Cultural, political, theoretical, and generational perspectives coexist within the same shared space, often generating tensions that challenge the group's capacity for reflection. When anxiety dominates, difference may be experienced as danger, leading to withdrawal, idealization, or attempts to silence opposing voices. By contrast, moments of symbolization allow participants to encounter difference without immediately converting it into threat. The capacity to recognize multiple perspectives without converting difference into threat represents a significant achievement of the large group process. In this sense, freedom emerges not through dominance or submission, but through dialogue in the presence of conflict and uncertainty. The value of the large group, as a conclusion, lies...
Yeah, please, let's wrap it up because we are over time. We will not have time for discussion.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, congratulations. I think your presentation was also amazing, and the topics of enactment and submission and everything that you bring and put on the table, it's so important. We need the one-day conference to read again these papers and talk about them, because it was so much information and so much theory and so much that you brought here today. Unfortunately, we didn't estimate it. This was not for a panel of 2 hours. This was for a 4-hour panel. Susan, please, you can share some thoughts, and then we can go to our plenary speaker, to Iohannis. He has an amazing presentation. I invite you all. So Susan, please.
Well, I'm just reminded of a client who works at a big university, and they went through a reorganization, and she had so much fear and anxiety and difficulty with this. But she's processed it in therapy and got to a place where she could express her feelings about it. I mean, it's just demonstrating what you've been presenting here, how her colleague is still stuck in wanting things to go back to the way they were and still very angry. My client has processed this and seeing how she can be more proactive and more participatory. And so your understanding of the dominance and submission that was just triggering her all over the place, but she was able to find her voice and her agency. And so thank you very much for your insights to and I'm applying it to this university setting, this institution where these dynamics happen. So yeah, it's been very helpful for her to find her voice and to say and have dialogue about whatever the troubling situation is. So thank you.
So thank you everybody for being here today. Diane, all 4 papers were brilliant individually and complemented and reinforced each other. Yeah, that's true. And Steve, hands up. I'm very proud and very honored, and I hope this is the beginning of many, many conferences together in psychohistory. I invite you to join room number 1. Iohannis is an amazing plenary speaker, and he will speak about the trauma and memory on individual and collective life stories. So maybe you will find it interesting. Thank you all for being here. I'm sorry we couldn't speak more and share thoughts, but I promise there will be future occasions. Thank you all.